Welcome back. Now, Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Finance has called out the banking sector for its lack of transformation. The committee says black professionals occupy less than 20% of executive roles in larger financial institutions. Members of Parliament also raised concerns at the South African Reserve Bank over alleged manipulation of the rand by some of the country's major banks. Let's unpack this a little bit because it still becomes one of the priorities that must be unpacked by President Cyril Ramaphosa and, of course, then by the Finance Minister as we head towards that budget speech. We're joined by Parliament's Finance Committee chairperson, Dr Joe Maswanganyi. Dr Maswanganyi, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Let's just talk about the exact concerns here. It's the lack of transformation, but it's not new. This is something that has been the case ultimately since the dawn of democracy in this country. How do we change it?
Yes, thanks, Ravi. We have had a meeting with the financial sector and in particular the banking sector. We raised the issues of transformation. Transformation will be a subject for debate as long as there's no transformation in that sector. Amongst other things, when we deal with issues of transformation, is the issue of ownership. Who's owning these banks? Are blacks participating in the ownership of those banks? And who are they? Because banks like to conceal information. They will say we have reached a level 1, a triple BEE, but they can't disclose whom are they talking about. The issue of inclusion. There are so many people who are still unbanked today because there are so many barriers of entry. The issue of procurement, and of course, we don't have black banks. Instead, black banks that we have are collapsing. The case of the VBS, and recently the case of Itala Bank. So these are key issues that we are dealing with. And of course, the problem of discrimination when it comes to lending.
Yeah, but some of these banks are not failing because of a lack of support. I mean, Itala Bank itself had over 250,000 depositors, right? So it's not for a lack of support. It sometimes is for corruption measures and all of those being in play as well. How much does that need to be dealt with when it comes to, black banks, that is, then, in order to get it right, in order to have the right number, then, of banks, ultimately then leading to greater equality?
If ever there is corruption, the shareholder, like in the case of the Itala Bank, which is the Department of Economic Development and the government of KwaZulu-Natal, has to deal with that. You have to remove the board and the managers. But that cannot justify that the bank has to be liquidated. On the 3rd of December last year, the parliament has taken a resolution that the government at national and provincial level should recapitalize the bank because Itala has got a footprint in deep rural areas like Ingwavuma, Tugela, and other areas. The same with the then VBS. So we do acknowledge that there's a governance challenge like we have in other SOEs, but the shareholders have to deal with those governance challenges.
What about legislation? Can we also say that perhaps we failed ourselves with regards to legislation? We speak about things like BEE, for example, the legislation around creating the kind of development finance corporations that we need in order to bank the unbanked, but perhaps we aren't as stringent and as strict in enforcing those laws so that we have the amount of banks that we need and ultimately then having transformation.
That's another issue that Parliament is going to look at, to amend the legislations that are there, to make sure that there is an active participation of blacks in the finance sector, because the finance sector is the biggest sector in the country. It controls more than 25% of the GDP with assets worth more than 21 trillion. And those assets are not invested back into productive sectors of economy, be it industrialization, IT, agriculture, and the like. If those assets were invested in productive economy, we will not be having the problem of unemployment, poverty, and inequality that we are facing. And we raise the other issue of lending practices, where you find that in the main, blacks are given access to loans that have to do with depreciating assets, like cars and stuff like that. Whereas the previously advantaged, that's the whites, are given mortgage loans of more than 2 million, whereas blacks are given loans of almost 527,000.
Yeah.
That's a report come from Human Settlement. So in all this, what we're raising, we rely on the investigation done by the FSCA, FSTC, Competition Commission, and other regulatory bodies that are there. So we are not just flying figures all around for the sake of attacking banks. We are not attacking banks.
Yeah.
We are dealing with facts that have to be attended to.
Many questions then ultimately as well to the South African Reserve Bank. What's your anticipation here? Are you calling for better timelines with regards to when we can fulfill the call for transformation within South Africa's private and public lending segments? And also then to say to the South African Reserve Bank, you need to be a lot more stringent as, of course, the prudential authority on banks then as well, in order to ensure that we don't have the manipulation of the rand situation as we had previously.
The Reserve Bank must do more. It should not be seen to be too strong and flex its muscle when it comes to the black banks. It must do more to control even the big four, which control more than 84% of the market share in the banking industry. You had a situation, for instance, during COVID, where government issued the 200 billion rand guarantee. Instead, the banks spent almost 18 billion, and the better part of it was spent on a white business. As we experienced a lot of black businesses collapsing during COVID, 2.2 plus million people lost jobs, whereas there was 200 billion. Yeah. It's the very same banks that were unwilling to issue out the money as guaranteed by government. So there are lots of issues. Yeah. We do acknowledge that to a certain extent, there is progress in regard to transformation from 1994. But we believe more should be done. In a country where blacks are in the majority, they should be seen to be very strong in the economic sector of this country. They can't be playing outside the margin of the economy.